that reminds me, but I have to let me spotlight myself. Okay. Um, one time a friend of mine came over to my house and he told me I'm really depressed. He put his bottle of vodka on the table. He said, "That's it. I'm going to drown out my sorrows." So I picked up his bottle and I held it really high. He says, "Rabbi, what are you doing with my bottle of vodka?" I said, "Listen, I'm lifting your spirits." Okay.
Oy,
Boy, that was pretty good, though.
oy.
That was pretty good.
Okay. All right. Let's go with a marriage one if we can. My wife said, because of my addiction to antidepressants, I guess I won't need those anymore. All right. All right. We're going to leave the marriage jokes off. Anyways, why are people from New York always so depressed? Because the light at the end of the tunnel is New Jersey. Sorry if you're from New Jersey. I made a website for depressed tennis players. Unfortunately, the servers are all down. Okay. That is.
He's on a roll tonight. He's on a roll tonight.
Oh my gosh, that's all my jokes for tonight. That's all.
Could be all your jokes for a month.
That was also good.
Okay. All right. Listen, I got a couple fans. It's always good. Keeps us cool when I got fans. Okay. All right. So now that we've got all laughing in, I'm going to mute everybody if you're okay with that for a moment, and I will lead in over here. All right. And you can always unmute and discuss. Of course, if you have any comments, try and keep them short. All right. So let's go back to the history of Tisha B'av before anything else. So the history of Tisha B'av is, what is the first event that happened on Tisha B'av? Does anybody know? You can put in the comments. What is the first Jewish event that happened on Tisha B'av? First negative event. I'll give you a hint. It happened. Aaron died. No. Golden calf. No. Golden calf was on the 17th of Tammuz, so it's close. Baseless hatred. But what was the bad event that happened? Baseless hatred. Okay. Eating the forbidden fruit probably means the spies. Very good. The spies. Correct. The answer is the spies. So the spies came back and gave a bad report on the land of Israel on Tisha B'av. That's when the Jewish people cried. And if you look in the Rashi over there, Rashi says that God said, "You're crying for nothing. I'm going to make sure in the future you're going to be crying for something." It's like when my kid is crying because they want a candy. So I say, "You're crying for nothing." So I slap them. No, I'm kidding. Okay, but that's the idea. God said, "You're crying for nothing. I am going to give you a reason to cry." And so 1,500 years later, the first temple was destroyed on Tisha B'av. And 5 centuries later, the second temple was destroyed on the same exact date of Tisha B'av. The tragedies for the Jewish people did not end there. The Romans destroyed the city of Beitar. Beitar was one of the last standing cities of the Roman onslaught. I think Masada was the one after Beitar, but Beitar, I think, was the second to last city to survive the Roman onslaught. But Beitar had a lot more of, it was a lot larger than Masada. And on the day of the 9th of Av, Beitar was overrun by the Romans and everybody was massacred, and blood flowed freely. A river of blood was flowing. We also have other terrible events that happened. The Jews were expelled from England on Tisha B'av. The golden age of Spanish Jewry was over as the Spanish Inquisition started on Tisha B'av, and World War I as well started on Tisha B'av. So just as an aside, before we go further in the class, since we see that Tisha B'av has had so many terrible events, in Jewish customs in general, in the 9 days, it's advisable to stay away from anything that could be dangerous. Just really don't really go anywhere because they're calamitous days. And unfortunately, even as of in recent history, many years, not this year, but there have been stories and terrible stories. So it's always advisable, not to travel on the actual day of Tisha B'av at the very least. I know there's somebody who was telling me he wants to travel on Thursday. I says, listen, just wait till Friday. So again, on the day of Tisha B'av, try and stay put, and wherever you are, to try and not do anything too risky or dangerous. So I'll try not to tell any jokes. Okay. But that being said, let us get some history. Let's go get some history of the Tisha B'av. Oh, did this open? Let me open that. Okay, and I'm going to share text over here because JLI has been kind enough to give us some text. So let's, if you have a fake text, is it called context? Okay, all right. Let's move down over here. All right, so here's from the book of Jeremiah. So here is, so we're going to look at the book of Jeremiah because you may be wondering, I keep telling you it happened on the 9th of Av, but here in the book of Jeremiah, it actually says the 10th of Av. So let's take a look. It says like this, and in the 5th month of Av, because on the Jewish calendar starts with the month of Nisan, so the 5th month of Av, on the 10th of the month, that was the 19th year of the rule of the king Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and Nebuzaradan, the chief executioner, came and stood before the king of Babylon in Jerusalem. So there it says, so the problem with that is that this text is basically saying that the destruction was on the 10th of Av. Now, Tisha B'av means 9. So where do we get the 9 from? In fact, in the book of Jeremiah, it doesn't even say 9 again. And just to give you some history, the sages actually debated when we should celebrate Tisha B'av. Of course, it wouldn't be called Tisha B'av. Some sages said it should be celebrated on the 10th of Av. Some sages should be celebrated on the 9th of Av. So what's the source for the 10th of Av? I see it says 10th. What's the source for the 9th of Av? So we're going to look at the Talmud. The Talmud is going to bring 2 verses. So it says like this. The verse starts, and in the 5th month of Av, on the 7th day of the month, being the 9th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. All right, so this is the text that we just read. He burned the house of God. All right, so the first text that we read from Jeremiah says it was on the 10th of Av. Another verse states, in the 5th month of Av, on the 10th of the month, the sages taught, I don't know why they're translating it wrong. Okay. All right, so the sages taught like this. It's impossible to say the 7th of Av was the true date of the destruction, since the verse state it was the 10th. However, it's also impossible to say the 10th was the true date, for the verse says it was the 7th. In other words, there is another verse in Melachim, in the book of Kings. There's another verse in the book of Jeremiah 52:12, which says that it was in the 7th month. Okay, so the question is, was it the 7th or was it the 10th? So he says like this. How do we resolve the contradiction? The enemy entered the sanctuary on the 7th. They ate and befouled it on the 7th, 8th, and 9th. Close to nightfall on the 9th, they set it on fire, and it burned continuously all the entire day. As it is stated, woe to us, for the day has gone, for the shadows of the evening are stretched out. This then is what Rabbi Yochanan said, if I were alive in that generation, I would have established the day of mourning on the 10th, as it was then that most of the temple actually burned. The sages argue that the primary factor is when the calamity began, which is on the 9th. So here we have, again, there's a verse says the 7th, another verse says the 9th. The sages of the Talmud basically said, all right, the 7th, they entered the temple, they defiled it, 7th, 8th, and 9th. On the 9th, it started to burn, and on the 10th, it finished burning. That is why actually the customs of the 9 days actually continue through the 10th of Av, midday through the 10th of Av. So many of the customs, not the customs of Tisha B'av, but the customs of the 9 days, for example, not eating meat and not listening to music, those continue through the 10th of Av, which this year would be till Friday afternoon. So again, here we have one sage which says we should establish the mourning on the 10th of Av, but another sage said no, we go with the 9th of Av. Why? Because the beginning, we follow always the beginning. In Judaism in general, beginnings are very important. We say kol hatchalot kashot. Beginnings are hard. We know in life, whenever you start a new project, the beginning is the hardest. The beginning is the over the hump. So, once God, so to speak, allowed his temple to be burnt, and that's the beginning of it getting burned, that's the worst part. That's how the sages looked at it, and therefore we celebrate it on the 9th of Av. All right, so this is also for our technicality. What happened? What was the timeline of the destruction? when did it start to burn? Why did they establish it on the 9th of Av? So till now, you've gotten technicalities. So now we're going to go to the next section, which is what does the mourning for the temple actually look like, and how does it compare to regular mourning? Okay, so let's take a look here. If somebody's parent passes away, this is what it says. This is what the Code of Jewish Law says. It says, everybody knows the Shiva, right? Everybody's heard of the Shiva. So the Shiva is actually split up into two parts. It says, Shlosha Yamim Lebechi, the first 3 days of the Shiva are set aside for weeping. Shiva Lehasped, 7 days, in other words, the full 7, is set aside for eulogizing. Shloshim Letisporus or Legiyot, and 30 days for cutting hair and pressing clothes. So in other words, the mourning that we have over a parent, and actually goes further. There's mourning, it's the first 3 days are the hardest. Then the full 7 days are, not lighten up, but you're not supposed to cry as much. You're supposed to talk more about your loved one while you sit there sitting the Shiva. And then once the 7 days go, you can get up, you can go to work, but there's still other customs of mourning that remain for 30 days. And then there are other customs of mourning that remain until the end of the year. So why am I bringing this? Because what's interesting is that clearly the Torah is saying, we don't want you to mourn too long. In fact, the Talmud tells us, and it says in other Jewish sources, that someone who cries too much over their loved one, it's a pain for their loved one. Their loved one doesn't want to see you suffering, right? So being sad for too long in Judaism is not allowed, even when you're mourning for a parent. Now the rabbis say, so now we have something interesting. The rabbis say about Tisha B'av, that all the commandments we follow for the mourning, we also follow on the 9th of Av. In other words, when you're sitting Shiva, all the rules of Shiva apply on the 9th of Av. It is forbidden to bathe, to anoint oneself, to wear leather shoes, to engage in intimacy. It's also forbidden to read the Torah, the prophets, or the writings, or study the Mishnah, the Talmud, or the Midrash, whether legal Midrash or narrative Midrash. Okay? So, in other words, just like when someone's sitting Shiva, they sit on low stools, right? We sit on Tisha B'av on low stools. Similarly, we don't take showers. The eating, of course, is a different thing. The fasting is a totally different idea. But the mourning part, the fasting is partially mourning, but it's also teshuvah. But we also don't study Torah. So study of Torah is not allowed for a mourner. So therefore, on Tisha B'av, we also don't study Torah.
Battery low.
Oh, my speaker just said it's battery low. I'm going to, well, I can just turn it off because I have other speakers. Let me turn that off. Let's see. Okay. And second, just change my speaker to someone speak so I can make sure I hear you. Don't all shout out at once.
Hello?
Okay, I can hear you. Awesome. Okay. So far what we have is Tisha B'av. We explained the historical significance of it. We explained that just as mourning, there is, just as when we mourn over a parent, similarly, all those customs apply on Tisha B'av. However, the reality is that the mourning on Tisha B'av is not exactly the same as mourning for a parent. So what are the differences? Now we're going to point out the differences. And you might ask, Rabbi, why are you going to technicalities? This is important. The technicalities, let me just back up for a second. And many times we look at the technicalities in Judaism and we wonder why. And it's a fair wonder. And obviously we have to follow God's law because that's God's law and we can do it anyways. But a lot of times looking at the laws can give us a clue about the meaning of what's going on. And that's what we're going to present today. By looking at the mourning practices of Tisha B'av, and in a way comparing it to the mourning practices of somebody mourning for a parent, we will see there's a difference between the two mournings, and that will tell us a little bit about the secret of Tisha B'av. And so the same thing, we should know that all minutia of Jewish law has lots of meaning. Sometimes we will understand it, sometimes we won't. But we have to understand that there's a lot of meaning behind all of the things that we do. So let's take a look at, here's a text about Tisha B'av, okay? On Tisha B'av, it says like this. Here's one difference. We said when somebody is a mourner, they're not allowed to learn anything. Okay, you're mourning for a parent, you're not allowed to learn it. Okay, you can read the laws of what you have to do, but other than that, it says like this. On Tisha B'av, even though we're not allowed to learn, it says like this. However, one may read parts of the Tanakh, one is unaccustomed to reading, and study parts of the oral law, one is used to studying. Sorry, that one is not used to studying. One may read the book of Lamentations because that's sadness, and from Job and from the sad parts of Jeremiah. Even school children do not study on Tisha B'av. As the verse states, the commandments of God are righteous and bring rejoicing to heart. All right, so we said like this. You generally cannot study on Tisha B'av, but on Tisha B'av, you are allowed to study certain topics, particularly topics which are sad, like the book of Lamentations and the like. Now, what about a regular mourner? So here's a text. I'm not going to read it, but this is the Tosfos. The Tosfos says that even though on Tisha B'av, you are allowed to read the book of Lamentations and the book of Jeremiah, if you're a mourner, you are not allowed to study any of these things. So what we're getting here is like this. Number one is that the mourning level of Tisha B'av is not as strong because there are certain elements of Torah that we are allowed to study. Another difference is, which I'm not going to quote here, is tefillin. Okay, a mourner, at least on the first day of mourning, does not wear tefillin. Okay, but Tisha B'av, we do put on tefillin. Now we put on tefillin in the afternoon, but we do put on tefillin on the day of Tisha B'av. And why? So the text says like this. He says, let's take a look. This is from Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. And, I got to go here. He says like this. It is logical. Wow, that's really big. It is logical to assume that we are obligated to don the tefillin on Tisha B'av, since the ban on wearing them applies even to mourners only on the first day, and Tisha B'av is certainly more lenient than the 7th day, than the 7 days of mourning. Okay, so that is what we're saying here. So what it emerges is that Tisha B'av has certain leniencies. So why are there leniencies? So you might say, well, the leniencies are because, we're not, how are we expected to mourn for thousands of years, the same manner as somebody mourns for their parent, right? That's one way of looking at it. However, the question still remains is, so what is Tisha B'av? If we're not expected to mourn for so many years like we mourn for a parent, why are we expected to mourn at all, right? Typically, the nature is that sadness after a while dissipates, right? The nature of the human being. It's one of the blessings that God has given us, is that, people pass away and time heals. Obviously, there are days, we have worse days, we have better days, but generally time heals. And so the question we have is, what is with this mourning that the sages instituted for Tisha B'av? For thousands and thousands of years, we've been mourning Tisha B'av, that on the one hand, it's a very strong type of mourning. At the same time, it's not like mourning for a parent exactly. It's a little bit different. So how do we view this mourning? Is this mourning just the pure sadness? What's the purpose? What's the goal in this mourning? What are we trying to accomplish by being sad on Tisha B'av? That's kind of the question. In other words, we understand the first couple generations, they were sad. We haven't seen a temple for thousands of years. What exactly are we mourning, and what does this mourning accomplish is the question, and that is why we call the class From Mourning to Mourning. We want to know, what is the purpose? What can the mourning accomplish, and how does it accomplish it? And the question is even deeper, because sadness doesn't really accomplish much. Sadness is just sad. That's why when a parent passes away, we say you should be sad for a certain period of time. But if you remain that sadness the rest of your life, you will not be doing the deceased a favor, because the deceased wants you to get on in life. And if you're going to be sad for that week, for the rest of your life, you're not going to get much done. So we understand that sadness, we need to release our emotions, but it's not really accomplishing much beyond that. So that being said, we are thousands of years past the temple. I don't know if we need to release our emotions of the sadness over the temple. What exactly is this sadness here to accomplish? So for that, we're going to go to the second part of the class, the Jewish view on sadness. And really, there's different types of sadness is what we're going to present. And the Hasidic sadness, as you can imagine, will be a little happier. They say a joke, on Purim, when we read the Megillah, there are certain parts of the Megillah we read in the tune of Eicha, we read in the tune of Tisha B'av. You have a couple lines there when it speaks about, the decree that Haman made. So they said, why did they put those verses in there? They put those verses in there to make the people who, I don't want to say any groups per se, but those who enjoy a more sad Judaism, to make them happy on Purim. So we'll give them a couple sad lines. So then the question is, so why don't we have any happy lines in the Eicha, right? Why can't we put any happy lines in the Book of Lamentations to make the Hasidim happy? And the answer is that Hasidim can be happy even when they're reading the Book of Eicha. So we don't need the lines, we can have our happiness. So we're going to explain that. Yes, the Megillah has a couple lines of sadness. Okay. All right. So let us take a look at a line by King Solomon. Now, King Solomon, he was generally very smart. Why I say generally is because he's generally very smart because he married many wives. So aside from that, he was very smart. And here he has in the book of Proverbs. Let's take a look. He says something very interesting about sadness. Let's take a look. 1 second. Someone's here. 1 second. All right. Okay. All right. All right. You got the pages over there, page 11. Okay. So it says like this: in all suffering there is benefit, and we don't need to focus on the second part, but it says like this. The word suffering actually is mistranslated. The word etzev in Hebrew, atzvut, means in sadness there is benefit. Okay, so King Solomon is saying, while sadness is rough, but there's a benefit to sadness. And so now we're on page, we're at text 8b. It's page 11 going on to 12. Okay. So the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, wrote a book called the Tanya, which for those who want, we do a Tuesday class on the Tanya. And in chapter 31, he discusses sadness. As I mentioned many times, Hasidim generally like to be happy. And the Alter Rebbe discusses sadness and how when you're sad, it's not a very great way of serving God, because as we know, if you have two people fighting, even if one of them is stronger than the other, if the stronger person is sad, they're not going to win. You need to be energized. Okay, you need to be energized. However, in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe explains that sometimes we need to utilize sadness. And this is what he explains here. So let's take a look. The verse states, in all sadness, there would be profit. The implication is that sadness has no inherent virtue. Rather, some profit is derived and experienced from it, namely true joy in the Lord, which falls from genuine anguish over one's sins at a propitious. I know what it means. I just don't know how to pronounce it. Someone's going to have to help me there. Moments with the bitterness of the soul and brokenness of the heart. Anybody knows how to pronounce it? No? Nobody?
Propitious.
Huh?
Propitious.
Propitious. Okay, out of propitious moments. As I mentioned, I mentioned this in my other class on Tuesday that often I have read words as I study a lot, but read a lot, but I haven't necessarily had to pronounce it. So therefore, that's how it goes. Okay, propitious. So what's interesting here, the Alter Rebbe makes his first interesting observation is that when it says, in all sadness, there will be profit in the future tense, that implies sadness in itself is not great, but it can bring to something good. Then the Alter Rebbe goes on to explain, so how is it that sadness can bring to something good? So he explains by differentiating between sadness and bitterness, or depression and bitterness. Now, you will not find this in a clinical psychologist's office. So bear with me for the concept. And hopefully you can understand it in your own words, and I'll try and present it. But it's basically like this. Sadness, there's a sadness that is very lethargic. It's not energized. It pulls you down. It's that's why they say it's depressing. It's sad. It makes you want to lay in bed. Bitterness, as the Alter Rebbe describes it, is a very energized feeling. You're sad, but in an energized way. You could almost say almost like an anger. It's almost like an anger because that's an energized, right? You're like angry at what's going on at what's happening. Another way of looking at it, another way of presenting it is that sadness. Let's say, all right, obviously the Alter Rebbe is talking about sins, right? We're talking about somebody who's sad over their sins. Sadness could mean that I feel that I'm worthless because I sinned, I'm terrible, and that brings to sadness, and unlikely for me to do anything positive because of that. Bitterness means I'm bitter over what's happening. I'm bitter over what's going on here. Yes, I'm the one that sinned, but I am bitter over the outcome. So let's take for example, you're a warrior. You need to conquer a city. Okay, you're a big warrior. You need to conquer a city. You approach the city and you get beaten back, and you lose some of your people. So a lesser warrior will look at themselves and will say, "My gosh, I'm a horrible warrior. I let my people down," and they go to the room and they cry and they never conquer the city. A real warrior is going to say, they're going to be bitter. Man, I can't believe that happened. I really need to get the city. They'll use the loss as an impetus. They'll feel bitter about it as an impetus to go then and conquer the city. And so then listen to how that's saying it's less about them and more about what needs to get done. He's bitter over the fact he wasn't able to conquer the city as the king asked him to. Now he's going to use that bitterness as actually more fuel for the fire to accomplish what he needs to. I think maybe you can see a parallel in sports as well. Maybe some people in sports, when they lose a game and they talk about, this is not going to get us down. We're going to go ahead. We're going to use this as fuel for the fire, whatever it is. I don't know sports that intimately. I know baseball, and baseball is a very slow sport. So I don't know if they ever get bitter or sad or anything. But anyways, that's another story. But you have so this is that idea, is that there's a sadness that you're sad, and usually it's actually a reflection of ego. Sadness is basically saying, my gosh, I didn't accomplish, I'm so sad, I'm worthless. It's a referendum on yourself, and therefore you just get sad and you lie down on the couch and you don't get anything done. So let's say you're trying to get a job, and you apply to 10 places and they all reject you, and you're like, oh, well, that means I'm a horrible person, I'm terrible, I can never do anything in life. And you feel really sad about how your parents raised you and gave you all this love, and you've just amounted to nothing. Or you can be bitter, and again, you can use the words however you want. We're using the words bitter versus sadness. Or you can be bitter over the fact that you don't have a job, and bitterness can be energized. Be energized type of feeling. So it's not the sadness that's laying on the couch. You're bitter and you're like, that's it, I'm going to go out, I'm going to get it done, and I'm going to go out and fight. So that's the idea the Alter Rebbe explains what it means when King Solomon says that sadness will bring to something good. It does not mean the sadness of the lying down on the couch and saying I'm worthless, because that will not bring anything positive. You have to get out of that mindset. But there's a bitterness, like that warrior that lost. There's that it has to be an energized type of sadness. Is really that's how you know it's a good one. If there's a sadness that's energized, not sloth-like, not melancholy, but a bitterness that can bring to something positive. So let's take a look here. Let's read the Alter Rebbe's words. Let's take a look. Lethargic sadness versus energizing bitterness. So this is on page 13. Depression is not an appropriate term for the feeling one has when they are bitter and broken about the fact that they are distanced from God and steeped in materialism. Depression is when one's heart is hard like a rock, devoid of all life and spirit. Bitterness or broken-hearted, right? You ever heard the line broken-hearted? Is quite the opposite. His heart is very much alive, animated, and stirred to emotions of bitterness. Such energy is different than the energy of joy and happiness, which stems from chesed, which is kindness, but it is still energy that stems from gevura, which is severity. The heart possesses both forms of energy. So there's a kind energy, there's you might call it negative energy or a strict energy or strong energy, a judgment type of energy, but it is energy nonetheless. And you want to be able to have, even in your sadness, some type of energy. And so here he says like this: at times a person falls prey to his baser instincts and falls under their rule. At such times a person must rouse his internal body, gevura, to alarmate those forces, for such forces can only be sweet in others. So he's saying when you get and I'm not going to get into it because we're not studying that section of Tanya. But let's read this next text, which is very much in line with what we said. Therefore, the rabbis of blessed memory said that a person should always excite the good nature that is whenever he perceives in his soul that he is in need of it. The translation is a little lacking here. Let me revise that, what it says here. Therefore, the rabbis of blessed memory said, a person should always make his good inclination angry over his evil inclination. That's really what it's saying. I don't know who came up with the translation. That is, whenever he perceives in his soul that he is in need of it. In other words, when the rabbis say a person should always doesn't mean always. It means whenever you see the need, you're going to use this power of anger. Remember how I said anger, right? Like I said, similar to that warrior, he feels anger. That's it. They got the better of me. I'm going to go get it. But the propitious time, which is the time specifically fitting for the majority of people, is when one is in any case of troubled by mundane worries or simply without apparent cause. Then is the appropriate time to transform the sadness by becoming one of the masters of accounts as mentioned earlier. What he's saying is like this, is that sometimes we are sad. We feel sadness over our favorite team lost the ball game. That's an energized sadness, by the way, I think. You see people smashing TV screens and, makes for good Instagram reels or whatever it is, right? So if you find yourself in a sad situation, even for non-religious things, it says that's a good time to also utilize that energy and utilize it to feel sad and the energized type of sadness over your religious issues in your life. And either way, that's the side point. The main point that we got from here is that sadness itself, if it's the energized type of sadness, can give you the push to get done what you need to do. And in some ways, it's a more powerful push sometimes than a happiness. Some people can sustain happiness for a very long time, but some of us cannot. And so the point here is, even if you cannot always sustain happiness, there are times when you get sad. Try to make sure you create the energized sadness, which will push you towards accomplishing more good. So you're already starting to get an idea from here that one element of way of looking at Tisha B'av is it's going to be the energized sadness. We're not just going to be sad and just horrible. It's just really bad. Can't believe we lost the temple. It's an energized sadness, which we lost the temple. We got to do something about it. It's horrible. It's terrible. All these terrible things have happened. So it's an energized type of sadness in which, yes, you will feel feelings of sadness, but not the sadness that makes you want to lay on the couch. So that is the first element that we have over here in defining different types of sadness. And there's a sadness that can be beneficial and a sadness that is not so beneficial. So although it's feeling of sadness, actually many people like feeling sad. I have to admit, feeling sad can sometimes feel really good. But and some people enjoy feeling sad and they love to wallow in it. But it's not necessarily Jewishly sanctioned and definitely not Hasidically sanctioned. Okay. Just to add on to this, there was what was the story that I wanted to say? There was a story here. And actually these stories will come later. Okay. Okay, so let us move on to the next section. All right. So the idea that sadness can positively mobilize exists in the concept of Tisha B'av. So till now I've told you, well, that's a type of sadness. But now I'm going to prove you again from the minutiae and the details of the laws of Tisha B'av, we're going to see that the sadness of Tisha B'av is tempered. In other words, yes, Tisha B'av is a sad time, but we'll actually see, we've already showed some laws where it's tempered. We're going to show other types of sadness. Someone writes here, I don't necessarily see sadness as necessarily coming from the ego. I didn't say it's necessarily coming from the ego, but it can be coming from the ego, particularly sadness that is a referendum on yourself. In other words, if you don't think about yourself so much, then you wouldn't be so sad. Okay, but that's more for another time because we're talking about the energized sadness anyways. Okay, so we brought earlier some laws in which we saw where the sadness of Tisha B'av is tempered. We put on tefillin, we study Torah, so it's not as sad as the first day of mourning over a parent. But now we're gonna bring on another element, and I'll give you some background. Everybody here has heard of the 9 days, right? Or if you haven't, pretend that you have. Okay, what are the 9 days? The 9 days are the days from the beginning of the month of Av until the after Tisha B'av. Okay, the 9 days are days in which we start some customs of mourning. We don't eat meat. We don't take showers. Okay, today we take showers because back in the day, showers was a pleasurable activity. Today it's a cleanliness issue. But even if you take a shower, you should make it quick. Don't go in a hot tub. All these different things. Why? It's based on the Mishnah says when the month of Av enters, we need to limit our joy, or I should say we need to reduce our joy. Now there is a similar statement that is given in the month of Adar. Does anybody know what it says about the month of Adar? And if you don't know what the month of Adar is, you can pretend. Okay, but what does it say about the month of Adar?
We're supposed to be happy.
Huh?
Supposed to be happy.
Right. It says Marbin Bisimcha. It says you're supposed to add in more joy. Okay, so again, the month of Av, it says you're supposed to decrease in joy. In the month of Adar, it says you're supposed to add in joy. All right, does anybody know what specifics Judaism says we decrease in joy when the month of Av enters? What are things that we do not do? Anybody knows? I already told you a couple before, so I hope you remember. Anybody knows things we should not do the 9 days?
We don't
Yeah,
listen to
sure.
music.
No listening to music, okay.
No parties,
Wash clothes.
Parties, wash clothes, okay.
What about get married?
No getting married. Is that a joyous occasion? No, I'm kidding. Okay.
That's a good one.
No. No
don't eat
getting.
meat
Huh?
except on Shabbos. Don't eat meat or drink wine except on Shabbos, or if it's a special like a bris.
Yeah, very good.
Okay.
All right. So everybody's picking up different details. Correct. Different details of things we're not supposed to do during these 9 days. We're going to see text in a moment. Does anybody know when it says in the month of Av, we're supposed to add enjoy? Does anybody know what that refers to? Anybody ever heard from a rabbi defining means to increase in joy? Nobody answered. Good,
I
because
didn't hear what you said, Rabbi.
when it says that in the month of Adar, we're supposed to increase in joy. Does the code of Jewish law, or have you heard any definition what that means? It just says add in joy. What does that mean? How do you, what am I supposed to do? Eat more Snicker bars? Is Snickers even kosher?
I usually drink more.
You drink more wine? Okay. 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 All right. But these are things that you do, but it doesn't define it anywhere. Okay.
Right.
So here's the idea that we're going to present is that in the month of Av, when it says we're supposed to become more sad, it defines what the sadness is.
Right.
When it says we're supposed to become joyous, it does not define what the joy is. So what does that tell us? Does do definitions limit or do definitions expand?
They limit.
They limit. Very good. Definitions limit. And so here's the powerful idea. Is in the month of Adar, it says we should become joyous, and it doesn't tell us what to do because we should become joyous in everything. There's no limit to how much you can become joyous. The month of Av, when it says we're supposed to become more sad and we're supposed to decrease in our joy, it gives limitations. It defines us because it actually wants to limit us to say, don't just become
Right.
depressed. These are the things that you should be sad in, and don't try and add any more stuff. Because yes, we are meant to become sad, but as I mentioned earlier, is that sadness has a goal, and we don't want to become overly obsessive in the sadness. And that is why we have a definition for the sadness. We do not have a definition for the happiness. It's not because we don't have anything to be happy about, but there's no limit to what you can be happy about. Conversely, there are limits to what we can be sad about. So let's take a look here. Someone mentioned barbershop also. Yes. All right. Let's take a look here at some definitions. I'm just going to throw it up on the screen, but I'm not going to read it. There you can read a couple of things that it says that we should limit, that we should not do. It's text number 10b. A couple of the things that we should not be doing in the month of Av. And there are other things people don't do today because of danger, like swimming as well is something we don't do, going into the ocean, things of danger. But
Right.
you go to mikvah, but you don't go swimming or whatever. So here we have a couple of definitions. All right. So what I've presented to you twice in today's class is that there is an element, a little bit more joy in the Tisha B'av and Av. Number one is that it's not as strong as mourning over parents. Number two is that there's limits to how sad you should be. Just by the fact that it gives definitions, there are limits, whereas in the month of Av, there are no limits. In the month of Adar, there's no limits. Now we're going to bring a third concept that shows happiness on Tisha B'av. There are various customs of Tisha B'av that seem to be increasing joy. For example, on the night and day of Tisha B'av, we read a special book. What is the book called?
Aika.
What?
Aika. Lamentation.
Eicha, yeah, the book of Lamentations. Read the book of Lamentations. Now, the last verse in the book of Lamentations is very sad. However, the second to last verse in the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, is more happy. Let's take a look at that. The second to last verse. This is text number 12. Text number 12. It says like this, the book of Lamentations. Return us to you, God, and we will be returned. Renew our days as the old. That is the second to last verse. And the last verse, which is really bad, says, for you have truly rejected us and bitterly raged against us. Now, you would think we're reading this book on the saddest day of the year, we should end the book of Lamentations on a sad note, right? Generally in Judaism, we don't like to end things on a sad note. If you look in all the tractates of the Talmud, if it's telling us stories that are really sad, it'll make sure to end off with a happy story, okay? So on Tisha B'av, you would imagine it would be the opposite. It's a sad day. We would want to make sure, all right, the book of Lamentations ends on a bad verse. For you truly rejected us and bitterly raged against us. That's how we should end, right? End on a sad note. But the custom is, throughout all Jewish communities all over the world for thousands of years, I believe, I haven't researched this if they've been doing it for thousands of years, but I'm guessing, is we repeat the second to last verse after we finish the book of Lamentations to make sure we don't end on a bad note. We repeat again, Hashivenu Hashem Elechem and Hashuva Chadei Shemenu Kekedem, and we even sing it in a higher voice, a little more joy in it. So here we already see that in Tisha B'av itself, we're ending off and saying the purpose of the sadness is not just for the sadness in itself, but we are hoping and praying for the day of return us to you, God, and we will be returned, renew our days as of old. In other words, the sadness is to ultimately lead to that. We don't end on a sad note. Even though it's a sad day, we temper the sadness by reminding ourselves that the goal of the sadness is not the sadness, but to ultimately to bring to the days when, as it says, when we will return to God and God will return to us. Actually, it says, return us to you, God, right? So we're actually telling God, don't wait till we come to you, you bring us to you. So the Talmud talks about it, but basically, the Talmud basically says there's a debate between God and the Jewish people. God said, all right, you repent, and then I'll bring you back to the land of Israel and give you all the good stuff. And the Jews said, no, you bring us back to the land of Israel, give us the temple, and then we'll repent. So who's going to win the argument? So the Jews said, this is what the Talmud says, or maybe the angel said, I don't remember exactly, said, God, in the Torah, you say that the law always follows the majority. So we're the majority. Hashivenu Hashem Eilecha. God, you bring us back, and then we'll repent. So for all of those of you who are depressed and wonder about how are we ever going to get out of this exile? Everybody, so the world is falling apart, and everybody's so terrible. It's okay. God can return us even if we haven't fully repented yet. I'm not saying you shouldn't repent, but it's already there in the Talmud 2,000 years ago. All right. Let's bring another custom that shows we're tempering the sadness with a little bit of comfort and joy. Says Rabbi Moshe Isserlich, the custom is to speak some words of comfort after the words of mourning so as to end on a comforting note. So that's another custom. And in fact, there's another custom on Tisha B'av. I don't know if they bring it in here. Is that on Tisha B'av, for those who know, we don't say Tachanun. Anybody knows here what Tachanun is? If you do, you can tell us.
Of course, Rabbi.
Okay, what's Tachanun?
Is our prayer in the morning?
Okay, it's a section of the prayers. What do we say in those prayers?
It's the penitential prayers. It's
Penitential prayers. Very good. Penitential prayers. So they're prayers, and those prayers, the penitential prayers, are not said on any Jewish holiday. So if it's
Right.
Purim, it's Hanukkah, Rosh Chodesh, any happy day of the Jewish calendar, we do not say the penitential prayers because we don't want to mix our sadness with the joy of the holiday. What's interesting is that on Tisha B'av, we also skip the penitential prayers.
That is interesting.
Okay, we don't say them. And here we see, because there is an element of joy in Tisha B'av, and we will expand it a little bit further as we get to the end of the class as well. But what you have from here is that sadness is not an end to itself.
Right.
As we've taught from the teachings of Hasidus,
Right.
is that even on Tisha B'av, we have to be mindful of feelings of sadness and negativity. We should never allow ourselves to wallow in the sadness, and make sure that all those feelings are motivated by feelings that will push us to become better, the energized type of sadness. And I'm going to now, we're going to read a letter of the Rabbi over here, which presents this idea to us as well in general life. This applies not just for Tisha B'av, but life in general whenever we get sad. So let's take a look here. Text 14. When a person is constantly filled with thoughts and feelings of remorse over past misconduct, which, by the way, many Jews experienced this. It is important to determine the source of these thoughts, whether they are emanating from the positive inclination and as such to be acted upon, or from the evil inclination not to be pushed aside, right? So how often do I meet a Jew and they tell Rabbi I'm a bad Jew, or people think to themselves that they're bad, and therefore what's the ultimate outcome of feeling that they're bad? Therefore they don't have to do anything good. They don't have to do X, Y, and Z because I'm a bad person. I'm a bad Jew. I don't need if I can't keep the whole Shabbos, I shouldn't do anything for Shabbos, right? The best way of determining this is by examining the consequences of these thoughts. If they lead to additional energy and vitality in the performance of mitzvos, conducting oneself to an even stronger degree according to Jewish law, then this is proof that these thoughts come from a good place. If by contrast they lead to sadness and melancholy, like your melon colleagues, neglect and laziness, or to feelings of hopelessness, then this is an indication that they come from the evil inclination which has hid and donned garments of piety. For all the above hinder the individual in his divine service. So what we get from here is that sadness, as we mentioned many times, the proof is in the pudding. And do those feelings lead you to doing more, or do they lead you to doing less? That is one way of telling, because feelings of sadness over sins can very easily be mistaken as coming from the good inclination, but very often it comes from the evil inclination. I've mentioned this. I've had many classes about this. People who had sad feelings, generally you're told to put them aside, do what needs to get done, and you can focus on your sadness and whatever fixing up you need to do at other times. But Tisha B'av is a day set aside to be sad, and we should be sad. But even then, we have to recall, even when we are sad, make sure it's the specific type of sadness that will push us towards good, because otherwise there's no point in being sad. Sadness has to lead to something, as King Solomon said. All right, we are getting to the last section of the class, and then I'll share a couple stories. So the last section of the class is like this. How are we going to mix the joy and the sadness of Tisha B'av? So Tisha B'av has, we viewed it as an engine of growth. However, to an extent, there are elements of celebration in it as well. And let's point to one custom. Or before I get to the custom, anybody here is a firstborn? Anybody here is a firstborn? Yes, firstborn. Okay, we have some firstborns. There's something called the fast of the firstborn. That is, on the morning of Passover, a firstborn is not allowed to eat food. However, the rabbis came up with a loophole. I don't know or whatever you want to call it, loophole, not a loophole. What is the loophole? Anybody knows?
Yes, if you hear a certain portion of Talmud, then you will be able to eat.
Very good. You hear a certain portion of Talmud, you're able to eat. Let me just expand on that. If you hear someone completing a tractate of the Talmud, then you can eat. Why? Because it says when someone completes a full tractate of the Talmud, it's a time to celebrate. And so I want to celebrate with my friend who finished the verse, so therefore I'm going to eat. Now, you can't really pull this off on all fast days, okay? You can't just decide to do that on Tisha B'av, and then you can eat, and do the same thing on, the other fast days we have on the calendar. But for whatever reason, they allowed you to do it on the fast of the firstborn. But what am I pointing out from here is that when you complete a tractate, it's a joyous occasion. So you would imagine that on Tisha B'av, we would not want to complete any tractates because it's supposed to be a very sad time. However, let's take a look here. And here we have a text from a great sage. He says like this. He says like this. I'm going to skip the first part, but like here, 16a. It is also their custom that for the days at the beginning of Av, they finish tractates of Talmud and eat feasts with meats and wine. Which, by the way, many people do. Many people who want to eat meat and wine during the 9 days, not on Tisha B'av, but during the 9 days, they will hear a tractate finish and then they will eat meat.
Right.
Both of these customs stem from the obligation and commandment to preempt the future redemption when we will all live in Israel on the second day of Yom Tov, which is practiced only in exile will no longer be observed. So too will the days of Av transform into days of joy in the future. I'm not going to get into the second days of Yom Tov. That's another discussion for another time. But what he's saying here is, why are we being joyous on Tisha B'av? Why are we hearing a completion of a tractate in the 9 days of Av, and especially on Tisha B'av, if that's joyous, because we understand, and it says in the prophets, these days will be transformed into days of joy and awe. So in other words, it's not only that our sadness on Tisha B'av allows us to then further grow and do what we need to do in the days after Tisha B'av, but we understand that the days of sadness themselves will one day become a future day of rejoicing and redemption. It says, just as we were sad during these days, God will make sure that we will be happy we will be happy during these days. Let's read this last text over here. So what's the idea here? Where is, but let me, let's take a look. We'll look at that in a second. What is the idea that, all right, so these days are going to one day be joyous, but right now they're sad. Well, the idea is that actually the fact that we're sad right now is in itself a sign of joy. What do I mean? For anybody who's been around Jewish people, you've probably heard this idea. The Romans disappeared, the Babylonians disappeared. Which other nation has been, desiring their land, for all these years? Right? Which other nation really cares, right? Nations lose their land, and after a couple of while, they don't care about it. And if they care about it, it's only for financial gain. Right? They don't actually care about the land. We as Jews have cared about the land of Israel itself for thousands and thousands of years. Like, why don't we just get over it, right? Why don't we just say, all right, you lost the land of Israel. Obviously now, of course, we have parts of Israel, but we're not even going to get into why it's still exile. You just have to go to Israel to find out for yourself why it's still exile. For thousands of years, Jews were kicked out of land. Why don't we just establish roots elsewhere? This idea that we as Jews have always mourned over the temple, even thousands of years later, is actually a sign the Jewish nation is alive. Why? As I mentioned earlier, I mentioned in the beginning of the class, I said, God made it that when someone passes away, we can slowly get over it. The fact that we have not gotten over our exile, the fact that we have not gotten over the loss of the Holy Temple and the land of Israel is a sign that something's not right. Our nation is not dead. Our hope is not gone. Our hope has not disappeared. When something is dead, the sadness eventually dissipates. But when there's life and holiness still left in the land of Israel, we can never get over it. He brings in here the text, he brings an example. He says, that's why it says, after Joseph was captured and then sold by his brothers, his father, it says, mourned for 22 years. He never got over it. The commentators say, why did he never get over it? Because the son actually never died. If his son had actually died, he would, to an extent, get over it. To an extent, he would move on. Okay, he would still be sad, of course, but he was not able to move on because being that Joseph was still alive, the sadness was always there 100%. That was a sign that Joseph was still alive. And similarly, us. The fact that 2,000 years later, we are still mourning the temple and we are still sad over the loss of our temple. Yes, an energized sadness, but we're still mourning over the loss of our temple. That is a sign that the Jewish nation and the Jewish hope and Eretz Yisrael and the land of Israel, all of it is alive. So let us take a look here. This is not my words. These are the words from the Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, a famous 19th century rabbi. He lived in Frankfurt, 1762 to 1839. So let's read the text as he says, as he reads it. So you don't have to take my word for it. So you can also see it's not just a Hasidic idea, okay? The sages tell us that Tisha B'av is called a holiday in which we do not say Tachanun. Those are the penitential prayers, supplicatory prayers. How can it achieve a status of holiday when, unlike every other holiday, we do not offer any holiday sacrifice to God? This can be understood by contemplating how for close to 200 years, by the way, he wrote this before, land of Israel, was established, the state of Israel. This can be understood by contemplating how for close to 2,000 years during which we have been given all the blessings in the world, the Jewish people have yet to forget what happened on Tisha B'av and have yet to dry our eyes from the tragedy. Every other nation and tongue that is lost has managed to forget their past calamities in the light of their current blessings. Why are Jewish people different? Because Jewish people love to complain. No, I'm kidding. That's not the answer. We are different because we do not accept consolation for the living, whereas God decrees the dead to eventually be forgotten from one's heart. All the other nations have no hope to return to what they have lost, and therefore they forget. We, Jewish people, still have hope and await the day in the future when God will descend below, wreathed in flame. How about the word wreathed? Okay, is that a Jewish word? And his righteous ones will live again and see and be satisfied from his goodness. We do not accept consolation for the living, and therefore our mourning is actually for us the deepest comfort. It is called the Great Holiday, which shows that we still know we will one day return to things as they were in the days of old in our youth. So the sadness of Tisha B'av, not despondence or dejection. Our sadness is a form of resistance to the cause of our sadness, and our sadness is in a way a form of joy to celebrate the fact that the dream of the Jewish people is still alive. The Mashiach, the temple, that dream is still there, and our tears should soon be transformed to tears of joy. And I will end off, before I get to my stories, we'll end off with this text over here from the Talmud, tractate Ta'anit Fas, page 30b. It says like this. Verse states, rejoice with Jerusalem and be glad with her, all who loved her. Rejoice for joy with her, all who mourned her. From this we learn whoever mourns for Jerusalem merits to see her joy, and whoever does not mourn for Jerusalem does not merit to see her joy. Now, what's interesting is that this text does not say that we have to wait until the temple is rebuilt in order to be joyous.
Right.
Because the verse states, rejoice with Jerusalem, be glad with her, all who love her. Okay, so here we have actually joy within the sadness. So there is a sadness on the day of Tisha B'av, but as we mentioned, it is limited, number one. Number two, it's an energizing sadness. Number two. Number three, the sadness is a sadness which we understand that we are sad because the dream of the Jewish people is still alive. And so this is why it is even more so why it's not a sad sadness, but is an energizing sadness. We are sad because we are fighting for something that we want, for something that we dream for something that we are yearning for, and we are hoping will come back very soon in our days.
Amen.
And
Amen.
I want to share a story of the Baal Shem Tov on this idea, because I said I would share a story. So one time, the Baal Shem Tov reached a town shortly before Rosh Hashanah, and he understood that he would not be able to leave the town before Rosh Hashanah. He would be stuck there. So he wanted to find out who's the chazan, who's the cantor in this town. So they told him the rabbi is the chazan. So he asked him, how does the rabbi pray? He says the rabbi prays with a lot of joy. Now it's interesting. We know Rosh Hashanah is very stirring melodies which sometimes can bring on sadness. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, thinking about our sins. He wanted to sound, what is this joyous prayer? So he came to the rabbi and he asked him, what's the story behind your joyous prayers? And he said like this, he says, even the servant in the king's palace, whose job is to clean the septic tanks, does so with joy, knowing that he is serving the king. And he says, the same thing as I too on Rosh Hashanah. I understand that I am cleaning God's septic tank. On Rosh Hashanah, we are cleaning out our sins. It's not just for us. It's for God. We're cleaning out the sins for God because of what God wants of us. And how could I not be joyous when I am serving God? And of course, the Baal Shem Tov says, for such a davening, that I want to be part of. And so here we have that this is the idea, is that we never get lost in the sadness itself, but focus on the purpose of the sadness and what the sadness itself can bring to. And on top of that, as I mentioned earlier, Hasidim like to always be happy. There was a Hasidic town called Babroisk, and they had two Hasidim there. One was a Hasid who would cry a lot, probably shouldn't have, but he used to cry a lot, and one was always happy. And they both served God. And even if the guy's sadness was bitterness and was the energized sadness, still, they explained that the one who was sad was not serving God to the full extent. Why? Because even the sadness, the energizing sadness, we have to understand is just a medicine. Just as a medicine is something a sick person takes, and when they're done with the medicine, they move on and live their life. Similarly, the sadness that we've been talking about is not something that we should be taking all the time. It would be akin to someone who's sick to always taking pills. You ultimately want to get to a place where you're always healthy. Okay, unfortunately, today many of us have to take pills all the time. But that's not really what we want. We want to be healthy. And so this is the joy of Hasidim, is that we temper the sadness of Tisha B'av. And so this is mourning to mourning. Summarize, we discussed the history of Tisha B'av. We explained that Hasidim, how we see within the laws, there is joy within Tisha B'av. We explained it again at 3 different levels. We explained that number 1, it's an energized sadness. Number 2, it's a limited sadness. And number 3, it's a sadness which really shows on a joy, because the fact that we can be sad for so many years tells us that the dream of Am Yisrael is still very much alive, and may it come to fruition very soon. So I look forward to celebrating Tisha B'av with you all. If Mashiach is here, of course, these days will turn into joy. But if even Chas v'shalom Mashiach is not here, we will celebrate as the way I explained it today, in this sadness that's an energized sadness, and ultimately showing that Am Yisrael Chai. And thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Rob.